Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about ideas and issues important to education. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these dialectic conversations for intellectually rigorous educators. In this episode, I spoke with Michael Pershan, who is a math teacher in New York City and recently published a Substack titled How Much Complexity Can One Theory Take?, which is a brief history of cognitive load theory. That was the center of our conversation, but in the interest of shortening these introductions, I will refer you to the show notes. I do hope that you'll visit our website, which is wegrowteachers.com, to learn more about our professional learning options. We also are in early bird registration for Inquiry Grow 26, which is October 26th and 27th here in Louisville. This event builds on our PBL Grow 26 events, which we've hosted annually for years. And if you are interested in a synergistic mix of cognitive science and inquiry teaching, this might be the event for you. You can find more information about that at our website, which is wegrowteachers.com. And you can also email me if you have questions about that or anything else at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. Now, here's my conversation with Michael. I am with Michael Pershan, or as some may say, Pershan, depends on which generation of the family you're with. But Michael's going to introduce himself. We're going to talk about probably many things, but in particular, one thing that caught my attention was a blog piece on Substack titled How Much Complexity Can One Theory Take? And it's all about cognitive load theory. Thought it was an interesting take in some of the history. So Michael, welcome. Introduce yourself and give the folks who are listening and the savages who want to be watching us some sense of who you are.
Yeah, I'm Michael Pershan, or Pershan. I answer to anything, really. And I'm a math teacher. I'm a classroom teacher. I've been teaching since 2010. So I don't know what year this is. I'd have to subtract or something. But I'm a math teacher. I'm a writer. I live in New York City. I've got a Substack now, but I've been writing for long enough about education stuff that I've had other blogs too. So it's this is just the latest iteration. But yeah, I write about education. I write about other stuff. And yeah, I recently wrote about cognitive load theory. And we started talking online, and so now I'm here.
Here we are. What was your schooling like as a kid? Like, how would you characterize or describe, sort of your K-12 and any university experience?
Wow. That's a great question. It's a little bit complicated because I went to an unconventional school in the first place. I'm a religious Jewish guy. I went to Orthodox Jewish schools first, kind of a co-ed K through 8. Which was pretty conventional schooling. It's a dual curriculum. So I was at school till like 4 with like Jewish studies taking up half the day. But like it was taught conventionally. It felt like it was recognizable as school. My high school was different. I went to a traditional yeshiva for high school, which with a very unusual schedule for an American high school. And I had, I think, 4 periods of general secular normal studies, history, English, that thing. But I also had from like arriving at school at 7:30 till I think the way it worked 1:50 in the afternoon. That was all Judaics, and that was a little bit unconventional. There's a lot of self-study, like with a partner, followed by kind of a briefer lecture period. And really at that point, instruction in math and science and history only went from like, I think 3 to 6. Was something, and that's actually the first school that I taught at was a yeshiva like that. Then university, I went to a typical university college, so it's like the instruction was back to the conventional American college experience, lecture, occasional problem sets that you work on either by yourself or at home, papers you got to work on yourself.
Were you, was your university, was it focused on education or was it some other discipline?
Philosophy. Does that get me in trouble? I minored in math, so I am kind of roughly qualified to do what I do. But I spent a lot of time in college writing papers, reconstructing arguments, Descartes, Kant, philosophy of language, Stalnaker, those people.
Well, it's interesting because we do professional development. I've worked with a couple of Orthodox Jewish schools in New York City area, and you're right. It is an unconventional. It's all relative, right? Such an interesting model of study about the religion and the texts, and then a shift into something that's much more what people would think is more traditionally academic. So. I have at least some context for something similar, and it is interesting, and I think has some effects on just the overall the way that the products of those schools might be thinking. So, anyways, be that as it may, so let's talk about cognitive load theory, because who doesn't want to talk about cognitive load theory? One of the things that I really love about the use of cognitive load theory is the way that it can help us inform and think about instruction and memory and all of those things. But I think that it tends to be simplified and used sometimes and applied sometimes maybe incorrectly is too strong a word, but I'll live with that. You wrote a blog piece published on the 28th of July that I think Michael Strong, who, if you're not familiar with Socratic experience, it's worth a look into his work. He's been on the podcast a couple times, but it's How Much Complexity Can One Theory Take? A new edition of an essay about the creation of cognitive load theory. So this looks to be at least a version that you have revised, but what's the sort of elevator version, elevator pitch of this, and maybe feel free to think of yourself being on a pretty long elevator ride.
I think I could do like the elevator pitch. People think in education or in the world, because education is such a big world, that you're really talking, when you're talking about the world of education, you're talking about the world. So people, I think, when they think about science of anything or research of anything, they think of the science you learn about in school, which is primarily the hard sciences, the ones that aren't where humans are the subjects, biology, geology, archaeology, physics, chemistry, where you run experiments and there are theories that are clearly the best. And the human sciences, including like nutrition science, exercise science, and psychology, which includes the learning sciences, are not exactly like that. Instead, it's difficult to figure out what the most useful theory will be to be productive for learning stuff. And theory is much less easy to pin down than in the hard sciences. So cognitive load theory is a great example of this, because cognitive load theory, okay, the elevator did get kind of long.
That's all right.
Because I started with the abstract. It's a teaching mistake. You start with the concrete stuff, then you get abstract.
It could be Willy Wonka's elevator, right? It just goes right through the roof and keeps going.
Yeah. But anyway, John Sweller is the creator of cognitive load theory. He had some experimental results that were fresh, interesting, and he explained them with a theory that then other people were excited about. But over the years, there were active debates about whether the theory should change to accommodate more factors. And Sweller had complicated feelings about whether other factors should be incorporated. They would make the theory better at some things, but maybe worse at others. And if you have to make a choice between a theory that is kind of fuzzier, but encompasses and explains more, or that's a little bit trimmed down and excludes some things that are clearly important, but might get in the way of designing and running experiments, which do you choose? And there's not a one answer. In chemistry, there might be one answer. In physics, there might be one answer. But in learning sciences, there isn't one answer. So you get these debates that are not resolvable, and they shouldn't be resolved. There are two perspectives on learning. And it's important, I think, to keep that in mind when you think about how research or science is used or useful in education. Ding, elevator doors open.
There you go.
Rolls right out.
Ladies lingerie, so on and so forth. So how did you come across, and I'm just curious because the science of learning and cognitive science advocacy group sometimes and quite often says, people in teacher prep and teachers don't know about these kinds of things. They weren't taught these kinds of things. So where did and how did this, things like cognitive load theory, or maybe cognitive load theory specifically, how did it come across your radar?
Well, like I kind of said earlier, I graduated college not intending to be a teacher. I didn't study education. And I was dropped into a classroom situation where I didn't have a lot of support. I was me and one other teacher. So that was it. That was me, math teacher. I'm sorry. There were other teachers in the school, but it was just the two of us, and I didn't really know what I was doing. And I felt a need to learn. This was 2010, 2011. There was a vibrant, at the time, vibrant math education online world of people who were writing blog posts, connecting on social media. There was even a kind of an in-person conference that ran for a bunch of years. It was really great. And I became part of that world partly just because I needed information about teaching. It was through there and really criticisms. I first encountered cognitive load theory probably on Dan Meyer's blog, where Dan Meyer was being like very critical of cognitive load theory. That was probably when it first, and critical of the kind of Kirshner, Sweller, Clark paper, this relatively famous paper, not famous, not like movie star famous, but this famous, right, relatively famous paper saying that inquiry and unguided instruction is not effective. So and that was challenging Dan's views and the views of a lot of other people in math education in this world. And so that's probably my first encounter. And then I wanted to understand it. I think I knew about Greg Ashman also. I knew about his work, and I knew about the research ed world. And my first impetus was like, I don't want anyone to have to tell me what this stuff is. I want access to the information directly. And so I started reading, setting out to read. It was a summer project at first. I wanted to just read it all.
And so cognitive load theory jumped on your radar, and away you went.
And away I went. And the truth is, I mean, I told you I first encountered it via criticisms of it. And I kind of set out to write this essay after reading it. And I thought, look, I'm going to kind of take it down. There's a part of me that was like, hey, I'm gonna show that this stuff, there's not as much there. But I really, the deeper I engaged with it, I really did get a lot out of it. And I wrote a book not that many years later because it started impacting my teaching. And I wrote a book about worked examples and teaching with worked examples, which is a Sweller technique. Not exclusively his. Nobody owns worked out solutions, but he studied them. He outlined their benefits. He told a story about why they're effective, and that did influence me tremendously. And I had felt the need to start experimenting with that in the classroom, and I found a lot of insight there. So I kind of came from a world that was very critical of this stuff, and I ended up admiring it a great deal.
Yeah, and I think that there's some similarities to my interactions with it. And of course, I've had Sweller and Kirshner. Matter of fact, I just emailed Paul. He's got a book that he's co-written with. No, not sure that I'll pronounce her name correctly, but I think her first name, Needy, is I won't try her last name. So it is interesting. It is useful. I'm curious how you would characterize yourself as a teacher now. And it sounds like it's changed a bit in terms of, what your priorities are. And, certainly one way to do that is to think about sort of explicit teaching and cognitive science and science of learning. And another sort of counter to that might be inquiry. I don't think that's a very useful, but it's kind of the land in which we live. How would you characterize your sort of thinking about teaching, especially teaching math right now? And has that changed? And if so, in what ways?
Yeah, I mean, that I mean, it's changed tremendously. Just in terms of like basic quality. And that's part of what I think, that's one thing that gets lost in these discussions, which is that competence cuts across these categories. Good teaching that's competent is got its own ethic and its own guiding lights that aren't ideological. So competent inquiry and competent direct instruction that doesn't leave kids behind, that cares about whether they're paying attention, that isn't trying to bore people, is holistic in a way that doesn't adhere to ideology, really, and sometimes causes teachers with very different ideologies to look pretty similar in the classroom because, you know, they're kids and you've got to find a way to get everybody involved, to make sure they're thinking. And that doesn't adhere to ideology. Not necessarily. I mean, it can interact with it, but like, so as you get more competent, which I hope, I think, I'm very sure I'm more competent than I was in 2010 and 2011. Your teaching just changes. My understanding of teaching has also changed, which I'm happy to talk about. Because I have kind of gone on a little bit of a journey there too, but it's also a little bit more complex and not easily ideological, I would say.
So one of the things that I have wondered aloud on social media and places about is this sort of assertion, and I don't want to push back on it because I think it would be useful, but the teacher prep programs, you know, and you said you weren't in an education program, but, you know, teacher prep programs, my oldest daughter is in one now. I'm always curious about what they're doing and looking over her shoulder to her, much to her dismay. But the idea that, you know, these teacher prep programs should be much heavier emphasis on, you know, science of learning, cognitive science, these kinds of principles, cognitive load theory. You know, to be fair, when I was in teacher prep, I certainly remember learning about working memory. I don't remember the term cognitive load theory, but I certainly learned about working memory in psychology courses and, you know, the ways in which we can keep a small amount in our brains and then, you know, long-term memory, so forth. So it wasn't that it wasn't there, but it wasn't explicit. But that to say is that, and I think this is a fundamental problem or challenge of teacher prep, is that it's not contextualized because you're in school, you're in a university, you don't have your own kids, you're not engaging in the teaching and learning process on a regular day-to-day kind of activity. So learning those things and knowing what they are is much different from, you know, sort of making meaning of them. And so I guess my question is, or my wonder is something like cognitive load theory and these cognitive science principles, how useful are they in teacher pre-service when we're not actually asking the you know, pre-service students, the college students, to actually use them in their teaching because they're not actually teaching, right? Does it make sense to include them in some basic form and then in professional learning on the job? Or, you know, I guess, you know, how do you think about those kinds of things?
I mean, I think, first of all, I mean, teacher prep is, I think, widely misunderstood, especially by people who I don't know what to say. I mean, people who, certainly by people with no connection to education, people who are outsiders and animated by science of or inquiry kind of parents. Parents are wonderful, but parents who get very interested, invested in education and want to talk about teacher prep, professors sometimes. And the big mistake is they really overestimate how powerful teacher prep is and how successful teacher prep is. Teacher prep is really hard. It's, you know, from a certain perspective, it's not successful very often. From the perspective of the people in instructors, I mean, every teacher is familiar with the feeling of, I taught as best I could. I hope these guys got something out of the class. And you start engaging with teacher prep research, which I did for a project some number of years ago with Justin Reich out of MIT, where he was trying to make, at the time, he had a laboratory set up where they were trying to use design research principles to create meaningful teacher prep activities that could be contextualized and game-like, even though they aren't taking place in real classrooms. So simulations were big in that lab. Simulated teaching, decision-making experiences, games that would reproduce some of the conditions of teaching, where they're grappling with, how do we make this stuff more contextualized and relevant? But you start engaging with teacher prep research, and you just see people who are as demoralized as I am at the end of the year in May. When the kids take that final exam, it's like, but we learned this. You know, it's not so easy to spend a year, 2 years with people who have no experience in a job and teach them in a way that will set them up for success in the job. It's just not easy. And yes, there's all these ideas about models that would kind of, I think most teachers would say the most useful part of their teacher training was, you know, the part where they're actually in classrooms with maybe their master teacher is good, maybe their master teacher isn't good, but people who have a good teacher that they're partnered with in an actual school, that's often the most meaningful part. That's great. It's really hard though. It's really hard. And the idea that you could kind of like brainwash teachers into being like progressive zombies with kind of inquiry ideology is, I feel like teacher prep professors would be like, if only we could have that kind of power over teachers. When instead what ends up happening is, in teacher prep programs, there's a lot of feeling of like, oh, we tell them all these things and then they just go and they do whatever. They stop listening to kids. They enter a school and it's just worksheets all the time. You know, we see our graduates, and a lot of the times they're just teaching the same old, no matter how many times we talk about, you know, the importance of listening to students' ideas or making sure that they're doing engaging, motivating projects that connect to their culture. It's just, they just do whatever. And it's really, the school culture is really much more powerful, and the demands of the job are much more powerful than anything we can do. So when you say, like, I think certain people in the science of learning world sometimes really overestimate what it would mean to, instead of teaching, and I don't doubt that schools of education are generally, you know, progressively aligned. That's basically true in my experience. So what if they weren't? What if instead of being progressively aligned, they were science of learning aligned? Well, I think what you'd have is exactly the same situation you have now, except instead of people being like, you know, we send them off and they don't listen to student ideas, they just do worksheets, the same old thing. You'll be like, I don't know, they keep doing projects, they keep you know, they don't do direct instruction, they're not giving feedback effectively, you know, they're not using worked examples, they're just giving worksheets out and it's saying, you know, do your best, which is not aligned with science of learning principles. So I think you just get disappointed cognitive scientists instead of disappointed mass education professors. And like, the culture of teachers right now is, yeah, it's progressive. But what it means for it to be progressive is that teachers feel a little bit guilty that they're not being more progressive. And so, because, you know, they remember that the right way, or they're angry. They're like, oh, they have no idea. So there's kind of an emotional relationship to progressive teaching that doesn't actually really translate that often into classroom stuff. If you'd like to swap that out for cognitive science, I think the same thing would happen. And I don't think that cognitive science is so practical and useful that it would overwhelm these factors. I think you'd just have a different ideology. You'd have different people feeling guilty about different things, different people being upset that the cognitive science isn't relevant to the teaching stuff, because the actual classroom universe doesn't fit in well or doesn't easily connect with these principles. Any
Yeah.
principles.
Yeah, well, I've asked a similar question out, again out loud. It's like, so what would it look like? What do they think it would look like if teacher pre-service was much more heavily cognitive science? And I haven't heard any particularly strong responses, although I haven't asked a lot, and so to be fair, but to your point, and I've worked with who knows how many teachers around the world, not just in the United States. It's not unusual to come across teachers in our, let's say, project-based learning workshops who say, I never learned about this in teacher pre-service. So, while I agree with you, I think teacher pre-service tends to be more focused on things like student engagement and excitement and some of those kinds of things, which certainly I would think put in sort of progressive constructivist bucket. It's not like those are strongly on the uptake, or at least solid ways to do that, which is one of my concerns and pushbacks on the Kirshner-Sweller paper of minimal guidance is that that inquiry is the same thing as discovery learning. That it's always that project-based learning is unguided, and while that certainly can happen, it probably happens far too often. That's not what I would say is a good representation of at least good project-based learning or good inquiry. And I think a similar thing is true of, sort of cognitive science of learning. You say, well, explicit instruction is this, and this. Is that what's really happening in these courses, in these classes? And what are the limitations and what are the trade-offs of teachers who are really doing that faithfully? Because there are trade-offs, right? There are things that go by the wayside. This is a sort of side question, but it came up in a different conversation, and you were talking sort of about ideology and things. Have you looked into, or are you aware of any sort of relation between partisan political persuasion, sort of left-wing, right-wing, and ideology? Vladimir Kogan, who's been on the podcast, he's a professor at Ohio State, and he actually asked this question of me, and I said I'm not aware of it, but like AEI, which certainly is right coded, has got a series of papers that's really focusing on explicit instruction and knowledge, and using some of the papers of Kirshner and Sweller and minimal guidance, and I think misrepresenting it. That was what he was, I think, assuming that sort of instructional approach is now coded right. I don't know that that's necessarily true, but I'm curious if you've seen anything that indicates one way or the other, and how and when that might have happened, if it has happened at all, which I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's two things you could say. Like, you could see talking about just like what you see when you look around. And then there's, like the demographics, kind of dispassionately just noticing stuff. And then you can be talking about, like, is there something in here that's a little bit right coded or left coded? That second question, I'm not sure, but like, yeah, you look around and yeah. I mean, like, people who, are there's more institutional support on right-wing institutions for science and learning stuff. And there's more institutional support for inquiry and kind of left-leaning stuff. Now, why? I don't know. It certainly doesn't have to be that way. You could be a left-winger, and there's many left-wingers who would say, listen, reading and math is absolutely important, and it's a progressive issue, and teaching children effectively, especially if they're growing up in poverty, is a left-wing initiative, and I want to bring knowledge to everybody in an equitable way. And of course, you could be saying, I believe in Socratic dialogue because I'm a traditionalist. If you look back at the seminars of yore, I want, that's what I want. I want a seminary. I want us to be in like boarding school, like in Tobias Wolff novels. I want us to be, sitting around talking about Ernest Hemingway and the literary principles that will guide our new age or whatever. I'm just staring at my copy of Old School, which I really love. But that's making fun of it. He doesn't fit in there. But Tobias Wolff, Old School, good book. So like, listen, it doesn't have to be that way. I think if you look around in America, it kind of is that way. But like, I don't make too much of that. Our world's stupid. So there's a lot of stupid things that happen. So,
yeah, there seems to be an onboarding, and it's pervasive of, the sort of Carl Schmitt, us versus them, friend enemy distinction. And it leads to, it's certainly very obvious in partisan politics, but I've written about this and talked about this a lot, this sort of educational tribalism, and it leads people to do such motivated thinking and reasoning, that you mentioned, sort of this classical education, which tends to certainly be much more sort of small c conservative, maybe capital C conservative. That I see people regularly sort of denigrating or minimizing the importance of inquiry. When you think classical education is run through with inquiry, like it is a vital piece of it. So the ways in which they're sort of picking and choosing what should happen in teaching and what shouldn't happen, what good teaching is and good teaching isn't, it's like really just not a thoughtful approach, in that sort of us versus them mentality, the sort of nearest weapon at hand, and attack. And inquiry has unfortunately been put on the sort of more progressive side. So that must be something bad.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why that stuff doesn't animate me too much is because I consider it like up here. Like, this is teaching right down here, and you're not thinking about anything. And then up here is the theory of forms. This is where inquiry versus, direct explicit instruction live. And I live like in the middle. And I don't mean in the middle ideologically. I just mean like lower down. Like, I need a theory of worksheets. I don't need a theory of instruction. I'm going to give some worksheets. I need a theory of worksheets. I'm going to, be doing some mental math with my 3rd and 4th graders. I need a theory of mental math. I don't need a theory of how learning happens. It could be helpful at times. I don't mind having it. But I also need, what feels more urgent on a day-to-day basis is a theory or an understanding. I don't have to say theory, an understanding of, how my job works, how kids are going to react, how pieces of instruction fit together. So me having an inquiry versus a cognitive science kind of big picture framework, that matters. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but I am saying that you need a lot more to flesh out kind of a job. So I consider those kind of debates as planes whizzing by, like way up high. And I sometimes hear their rumble and I think, yeah, okay, there's a plane passing by. But I need to know how the cars are going to work when I'm crossing the street. I need to know if they're going to stop at the stop sign. I need an understanding of how traffic works, if I'm allowed to dart across the street now, or if I'm going to get myself in trouble.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of, I was talking with a friend, and I'm a political science. I have a political science degree, so politics and that kind of thing is really interesting to me. And I was asking him, talking with him about some of those issues, and he said, the government's going to do what it's going to do, and the president's going to do what the president's going to do, and I'm trying to do my job and feed my kids and live my daily life. And I think that's a good point for. I was talking with Hailey Hughes, and it's like we're having these conversations and debates which we think are existential and really super important, and teachers are coming to work and trying to teach. And while it's sort of a background hum, and some are paying more attention to the others, it's not nearly as important to them as it is to us, especially on social media, right? I mean, that's where that's where the world lives.
I want to be clear. I'm not anti-theory.
Sure.
I personally am someone who's benefited from people having expressing understandings of how teaching works and how kids learn and how people learn and how math works. It populates my mind. It guides my thinking. I mean, the other thing that kind of mixes this stuff up, I think. So I'm not anti-theory at all, but I think that theory is much more than that level of abstraction. Should be a fleshed out space with many more theories expressed about how other parts of teaching can work. But the other thing, and this is part of it, is that teaching is 180 days. It's a lot. You're not going to be doing the same thing every day in the classroom, probably. At some point, you're going to want some variety. And even within frameworks like cognitive load theory, there's this thing called the expertise reversal effect, which I write about a little bit in the essay, but that's where, when someone's new to a topic, if you give them a problem, they're just going to flail. But after a couple of days, they might have learned techniques that they can use, and they would be better off not just reviewing those techniques, but trying to apply them to new situations. So you're going to have inquiry, perhaps, things that look like problem solving in math days. Of course, it's got to be what the kids can productively do on their own. Flailing is never helpful as a teacher, which is maybe a point of disagreement between like hardcore inquiry people, including perhaps, people like Joe Bowler, which is maybe just a disagreement about what is productive. There are people out there in education who say, it's okay, kids don't know what they're doing, just tell them to keep trying. That doesn't make sense to me as a teacher or as my kind of theory of how people learn stuff. A bit of it is fine, but like once people are frustrated in your classroom, that's never been helpful to me. But like you're going to have maybe a couple of days, even within a cognitive load theory framework, where you're asking kids to do some problem solving, maybe to put things together. You're not telling them exactly how to do it. I mean, you kind of did tell them how to do each piece of it, but they're trying to put it together. If they're ready for that, you're going to be doing that. So you kind of need both. And so, yeah, the balance matters. The headline news matters. If you're like, yeah, basically every day kids get to class and they try a problem they've got no idea how to do, and then we talk about it, and then they learn from an explanation that I give at the end of class. To me, that's not going to work as well. I don't really like that. Kind of tried it, not a fan. I can explain why. But within my framework also, you're going to have some inquiry time or things that look like inquiry. It's just going to maybe happen at the end of learning instead of the beginning. So you need stuff. You need to know how to, I need to be able to kind of do a problem solving lesson.
Yeah, so there's that balance, right? And whether I think one of the problems that I've seen with the application of something like cognitive load theory is that it becomes sort of formulaic and algorithmic instead of heuristic, right? And so I have experienced conversations with people who would say what you've just described, where there's something like productive struggle happening, is terribly inefficient, or at least maybe not terribly inefficient, but at least inefficient, maybe not so terrible. But any inefficiency is something to be reduced and done away with. And so there's just this rush to really make sure that all of the cognitive load that is extraneous is minimized and done away with. And then the other side, you've got people who, like, as you mentioned, let's let them struggle, and they're flailing, and there's too much flailing, and they're frustrated, or it is terribly inefficient. So finding that balance, and I think cognitive load theory can be useful for that. Maybe this can get us back to the piece you wrote and some of the history and getting into complex learning and germane load. One of the limitations, surely, and I mentioned this in my conversation with Sweller, is the measurement of cognitive load. I mean, you can't measure cognitive load, but you can see evidence of too much cognitive load. At least I think you can. How do you think about figuring out where, because you're talking about that balance, right? How do you figure out, am I too heavy? Are they flailing too much? Or maybe I should let them flail a little bit more, because that's related to the issues of cognitive load, right?
Sure. It is difficult to talk about this without adding some context, because, thinking about how you manage frustration. I mean, you could say cognitive load, but, that shows up as frustration, not knowing what to do, hands shooting up in the classroom. Hey, excuse me, Mr. Pershan, can I have a hand? So let's talk about maybe what I used to do and what I do now. What I used to do when I started out, and I was very much kind of thinking about teaching as my stereotypical lesson is I launch a problem, a task, an activity. Kids work on it. I don't tell them how to do it. And then we talk about it, and that's where instruction happens. That's kind of like the problem-solving lesson beats in problem-solving, inquiry, math stuff. I assume it's everywhere, but whatever. So at that, so what are you doing then? So when you're planning, you pick an activity. That's the first part where you're planning for cognitive load, and you're trying to anticipate. You're trying to anticipate places where there would be, cognitive overwhelming or confusion or whatever you want to call it, frustration. And you're trying to anticipate it and streamline the launch of the activity so kids can, so that none of that is in the launch. And then you're trying to prepare, kind of equip yourself for facilitating the lesson, being the guide on the side, walking around, handling questions, thinking of hints that you could offer, nudges you can offer, suggestions, and thinking about what kind of work and ideas you're anticipating. There's a framework in math education that kind of emerged for this, which is like a series of questions. Oh shoot, I can't remember what it is. It's like 5 steps for facilitating productive mathematical discussions or something. Ooh, it's been a while. Okay, but anyway, so you try to anticipate moments of frustration in your planning. You try to look around, feel things out. You're constantly asking, do I need to bring everybody back? Is everything going okay? There's 25, 30, 20, whatever, 15. There's some number of kids there. You're trying to go table to table. Oh, you're okay. 1 second, you're going place to place. You start thinking maybe if things aren't going well, like, is there a way that I could get kids to be talking to each other, be a resource to each other here so that I don't have to be there to kind of walk, and, you do that thing. And then at some point you bring it back and you're like, okay. So some people got a solution, some people didn't. Okay, let's talk about it. And then you're trying to structure, and that's trying to manage load. Within that framework, you're trying to manage load. You're trying to manage load by anticipating issues, preparing the task appropriately so that there'll be as little friction as possible, picking the right time to come to the discussion. Okay. At a certain point, my stereotypical lesson switched from being that to being something more like, we're going to study a technique in the beginning with worked examples or something else. And then I will ask you to apply it during the lesson. And that's a different framework with different issues, different teaching issues, different challenges. But within that kind of more traditional, let's say, framework, then you're trying to manage load by making sure that you're not asking kids to do something until they have displayed an ability to kind of do it already. Meaning you're saying, okay, here's a solution, here's a question, but that's maybe a review question. Can everybody solve it? Okay, so okay, good. That's a prerequisite. You guys can kind of solve it. Okay, so here's a new thing. I'm going to show you a new thing. Let's discuss it. We have a discussion about the new thing. And then I say, okay, try it. Try a little problem right now. And they try a little problem. And if it goes well, I'm like, great, you're ready for the next thing. If it doesn't go well, then okay, we do another little one. In other words, by the time you start the task, I'm kind of more aware of whether the group is ready for it. And it doesn't require like a big swing in the beginning of the class, as it does in problem solving or inquiry, because, sometimes you'll be like, hey, here's this problem. I thought we're all ready for it, and no one can do it. And they're very frustrated. And then you're kind of like improvising a new lesson. that could go well or could not. So I prefer the second framework in my daily teaching. I really do. I can imagine, it's summer camp, math camps, or in electives where I teach once a week classes for really strong 5th and 6th graders. My classes might look more like the first, and that'll all be okay because the big swings are okay because the kids are really happy to be frustrated with math. So I'm not saying yes or no. I am happy to have both of these methods, but I think that managing load comes a little bit more lockstep in the CLT-ish style framework, but it presents other problems.
So how do you, in that, I guess either example or approach, but let's just say the second approach, how do you get what you hope is an accurate understanding of where they are in terms of what they know and what they understand? I think those are two different things. And I'd be happy if you want to, think of or talk about the differences in terms of what you're looking for and that. But do you use mini whiteboards? Do you use choral response? Do you, I had a wonderful conversation with Christian Moore-Anderson about his book, Teaching Meaning. And, there's the issue of agreement. Do students agree whether, 2 + 2 is 4, which is different from how are they making meaning of this concept or this formula or whatever that might be. And that takes some sort of a conversation, which is much less efficient than, a mini whiteboard that has an answer up there. So what are the tools and ways in which you are assessing their learning so that you can be responsive?
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, the answer is yes. The answer is yes to all the things, mini whiteboards, sure. Choral response, absolutely. Conventional problem solving, group problem solving, yes. I think where I might differ from what I used to do earlier in my career and what I think what people like Peter Liljedahl would prefer, he of building thinking classrooms, or maybe Joe Bola would prefer, is I often start class with a short problem solving sequence. We're talking 5 to 10 minutes. I don't mind it being mini whiteboards. I don't mind it being choral response. I don't mind it being something more that feels like problem solving with a partner of a challenging problem. I don't mind any of that. I do keep it relatively short enough for me to figure out what's going on, but also short enough to manage frustration and feelings surrounding that stuff. So that you don't have people very upset that they can't figure it out, or kind of like, oh, I have to sit next to this person because this person always explains it to me, which happens sometimes, but I think happen very often when I do inquiry heavy things. So yes, like all those things. I don't have, and I think that's not, I don't know if that feels complicated to me. That doesn't feel complicated to me. That feels like, yeah, you ask kids things that you want to know if they can do, and if they can do them. And where I differ maybe from some staunch traditionalists is it's not just drill, it's not just practice. I've got I sometimes think of myself as, if you were trying to describe me, kind of like maybe a traditionalist with a pretty expansive view of mathematics. If you were trying to pin me down, I think I've got a pretty rich understanding. I don't think math is just, 5 times 7. I don't think it's just solve this equation. I don't think it's just procedural skills. So that you could think of me that way, and that would be okay with me. I don't know if that's fully accurate. But then you asked about understanding. So it doesn't feel complicated to me. I've got a lot of things I want kids to do because I understand that math is rich and big, and it's not just about, mimicking the procedures, or mimicking is a mean word, I guess, but accurately executing procedures. You asked about understanding, and I could pause for a deep breath, or I could launch into a spiel about understanding. I don't know.
Well, go ahead on that spiel. I have a follow-up question, and I'll pose it, and you can choose your own adventure here, and maybe we can go on both adventures. But it's a multi-part question. So the first thing that you're doing with the students, is it a worked example that you're putting forth? And also, when you're doing that, are you telling them are you giving them one strategy for solutions, or are you perhaps giving them multiple? Because there's been some online discussion, Anastaki being the one that sort of started it, and people saying, I mean, her point being that if you, I think, hopefully I'm not misrepresenting it here, is that giving students multiple strategies would lead to cognitive overload, and that would be a problem. And I think there's maybe some other problems she might cite there. People saying, though, that you might give them multiple strategies or give them an opportunity to try to figure out multiple strategies. And relatedly, if I'm understanding sort of the Joe Bowler approach, is that we want to get students to know and remember things, but know them and remember them in ways that are sort of conceptually connected, not just sort of rote memorization, which is arguably less connected.
Yeah, let me kind of try to answer all those things. So first of all, when kids walk into my classroom, there's often a warm-up. This is not an unusual thing in the world of teaching. There's lots of reasons why it's good to start.
Warm up, bell ringer, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not starting with a worked example. Kids are trickling in. There's something to work on. It is ideally chosen as either review, a prerequisite for the day's lesson, something I'm curious to know how they think about, whatever. Prep for a quiz. I don't know. There's lots of things you do with that slot. Yeah, and I'm not rigid, that not every day is like this, but like, yeah, in a typical class, I think, what's the first thing that kids are going to do? And hopefully a lot of curricula these days do offer those things because teachers want them. So yeah, something that's a warm-up. That could often be a discussion. So there's a little bit of a discussion after that also, so that we have a chance to kind of talk and hear things, and kind of just not all be in one mode all of class. A little bit of variety is good for engagement and health, and also not being super bored, and different kids are good at different things. So variety is good. Okay, that's the kind of like practical question I thought you were asking. And then you're asking about, what do I think about multiple solutions, promoting understanding. And we were going to talk about understanding before. I think understanding is completely legitimate. I think that sometimes people have legitimate gripes about the way understanding is ballied around in education as kind of a mystical word that is nebulous, that goes beyond what you can see. It's this thing that we want kids to have but can't really describe, this je ne sais quoi. Like, yeah, I understand why that's annoying. And I understand the impulse to be like, therefore, understanding's fake. That said, unfortunately, I think understanding is like mega super duper very 100% real. I think understanding, and I think it's valuable, therefore, to try to articulate like what it is. In every subject, understanding means. I hear Joe Bowler talking about connected stuff. I think that's good, but like, unfortunately, that seems to me more the result of maturity and doesn't really tell you how we're doing it. And so I have a picture, and you want to talk about theory, you want to talk about psychology and theory. This is something that I feel like has given me clarity. And so this is like a little theory that I've pieced together from my reading that I'm happy to share. And that I've tried to write about. And it's sort of like this. We all have these kind of intuitions that this kind of fast procedural knowledge, this thoughtless knowledge, these learned reflexes. And that's what a lot of mathematical maturity is. You want to get to a point where you can just show me an equation and I don't have to really think about each step. I'm just like, boom, 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 solution. This is automaticity. And then there's this other thing, which is really thinking about what you're doing almost intentionally. explicitly. It's not instinct or intuition. Sometimes, very often, it's language based. Oh, I should divide both sides. Why? Yeah, because it's both. So I should divide because they're multiplying x by something. And that takes the form of a generalization, a principle. You should undo the operation. Oh, it says +3. I should subtract 3. If it says x minus 5, I should add 5 because the principle is, if you see an operation, you should try to reverse it to isolate the variable. Now, what's the relationship between those two things? What's the relationship between the explicit, almost linguistic, semantic knowledge, and the kind of automatic intuition, fast knowledge, fast thinking knowledge? This is maybe echoing thinking fast and thinking slow, these kind of dual processing theories in mind. So I think it kind of goes like this. You want to end up with the fast stuff, the automatic stuff, because that's going to enable you to do more complex things. You don't want to be thinking about your steps all the time. But the other stuff, especially when you're starting out, is really helpful. It can assign meaning to what you're doing and therefore give you a kind of scaffolding as you're developing those intuitions. It can correct your mistakes. It can catch misleading intuitions. If there's things that your intuitions and your fast thinking would make you think should go one way, this can kind of catch them and be like, oh, no, actually, train it this way. And so I think we want to use that kind of top-down principle. We want to teach those principles, and they're often linguistic. They're often in language. We want those explicit principles to guide beginners as they develop their procedural knowledge that will eventually be automatic. And that stuff's, that semantic stuff, the language stuff is understanding. Those principles are understanding. We want to give kids principles that they could say that will help them in the short term as they develop automaticity in their procedures. And you get people in education who say, well, if a kid can only, it makes me so sad to ask kids who are adding fractions, why are you doing this? And they are fully accurate, but they can't explain it. Well, that's okay. That's the understanding did its job. If you talk to adults who are very talented at some of the stuff, sometimes they're gonna have to pause and try to basically create an explanation for some of these math things. That's okay. Why do you swing the baseball bat like that? Vlad Jr. Well, maybe he can explain it. Maybe he can't. Maybe at this point it's so ingrained that but if he's learning, some coach would probably be like, you got to watch that. You got to bring the power down, something to make sense of it so he could remember it as he's up there getting reps. So we need an interaction between these things while kids are learning. And if it's only one or only the other, it doesn't make any sense. Why would you just have understanding without developing procedural fluency? Like literally why? Just so you could be a philosopher of this stuff? Why was and if you only have the procedural things, understandably, kids are going to be like, I don't know why, but like this is weird, and they're going to make mistakes. And some kids are going to make a lot of mistakes because there's nothing guiding them. Their intuitions are not strong, or it takes them a while to settle into them, or things that look a little bit different throw them way off. But the generalization can kind of smooth those over, be like, oh, these are all the same thing. Whenever, doesn't matter if it's on the other side, whenever there's a minus connected to an X, you should probably undo the, because you want to isolate the thing. So, and this aligns with cognitive science research. This is Bethany Riddle Johnson and Martha Alibali's paper that says that in mathematics, procedural and conceptual learning tend to move together, not because there's something magical about understanding, but because this is how you do it. You have your conceptual understanding, the principles and the semantic stuff, kind of moving along and being a little bit of like a bumper, like a bowling bumper that keeps you from getting in the gutter when you're doing the procedural things. So I think this is all very non-mystical. And I think that skeptics of this should, get their shots in and then not reject conceptual understanding, but use this very, very research-based psychological understanding of what conceptual understanding is. Now, by the way, the researchers in cognitive cognition studies readily admit that there is a lot of confusion here. But I think there's been a kind of good, within a certain community there, a good agreement that this way of talking about it might be useful. And I find it very useful, clearly. The clearly being because I haven't stopped talking about it for the last however many minutes.
Well, that brings up to something I put on social media, and I thought about just recently. I've thought about it before, but the quote, "Memory is a residue of thought," which I think is true, and I think is a valuable thing. There's a sort of mindset that that if you build the knowledge, then the critical thinking will come, and then there's I think another mindset that if you engage them to think critically, then they'll build the knowledge. And I think, as you sort of articulated there, it's a little bit of both, right? It's informing one is informing the other, and just focusing on one too much is, I think, problematic, at least rhetorically. And so I posted, so if memory is the residue of thought, my question to you, I'm curious how you would answer this, is which should we focus on more, the thinking or the memory?
Well, I mean, thinking or memory. If memory is the residue of thought, then you got to get kids thinking, right?
Yeah, because the reason I pose that is because I think at least my perception is that there's so much rhetoric from the sort of more traditional end that is so laser focused on memory, working memory, cognitive load theory, right? Like the working memory, long-term memory. If they get it into the long-term memory, if they don't get it into it's just rhetorically such a focus point. And they would acknowledge and do acknowledge that there's thinking involved in that. But to me, I like to have, I value and prioritize how am I getting students to think, in what ways, and are they thinking about the things I want them to think about it, and in the ways I want them to think about it. And there are different ways to think about things. And if you're approaching it from that perspective, the memory will come. And that doesn't mean that I wouldn't say, kids should memorize their multiplication tables or things like that. But I think I approach it from a prioritization on the thinking part, and the memory comes.
I think these are two languages. Ultimately, they're two languages for the same thing. And so the debate shouldn't be held in those terms, is what I would say. Because from the perspective of psychology, long-term memory is just another word for like you learned it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you know how to write an essay, that's a change in long-term memory. That's a change in memory. Like if I can discuss a poem, if I can identify themes, metrical shenanigans, if I can identify interesting images, and if I can write a poem, if I could write a story, that knowledge it exists in long-term memory. Where else would it exist? The brain has like working memory and long-term memory, and maybe like, I don't know, some other components. That's all very confusing to me because of whatever. Forget, I don't want to get into like a brain stuff. Like there's different systems. There's fMRIs where you can look at how things light up, whatever. Like the point is that like any thinking that you're going to be doing is going to be drawing on long-term memory. Anything that you learn is in long-term memory. So there shouldn't be a discussion based on that. And likewise, since learning is the residue of thought, if you would like to learn if you would like your long-term memory to have in it the knowledge of how to analyze a poem, you will have to think about analyzing a poem. So to me, the terms don't cut across cleanly. I think it is true that traditionalists, so there's a tendency in all corners of education and probably all corners of the universe, to take if you got something that you think is good, that's your whole world. If you got something you think is important, that becomes your whole world. And, maybe, and I saw this all the time in math education back when I used to go to conferences before I had kids and got lazy. You'd get people who would say like, I invented a new type of classroom activity. I don't know what it is. I don't want to make fun of people. So, but all I can think of is specific things that I want to make fun of a little bit. But okay, so it's I don't know, looking at thermometer-based math activities.
Mm-hmm.
They're really powerful, let's say. They could be. Why not? There's all sorts of interesting stuff in thermometers.
Mm-hmm.
And then you start being like, okay, so now thermometers every day. Every day I start with a thermometer warm-up. And actually thermometer-based learning it becomes like a thing. And I would like to decide whether, you really got to try it. It's the thing that works. And its advocates would say every classroom in America needs a thermometer in it.
Right.
We need a law that says that you have to have a thermometer in your classroom or something stupid like that. So, but if you talk to these people, they'll be like, well, no, of course, I don't think every day should be thermometer stuff. I just think it's important and people should talk about it more. So everything falls into that mindset. Growth mindset fell into that, right? Like growth mindset. Yeah, there's probably some good ideas in growth mindset. Did it need to be like the focus of everything for a couple of years? Probably not. And I think this happens with, it's normal. It's normal for advocates to take things in this direction. It's annoying, but it's normal. Mm-hmm. So the same thing happens with cognitive load theory ideas and maybe like cognitive science as applied to education more broadly, because like cognitive science studies skills. They don't study holistic. They study, they more frequently study skills defined in little nuggets.
Mm-hmm.
For a lot of reasons, not least of which is that it's easier to study them using the tools of cognitive science. So that's fine. That's totally fine. That's as fine as Sweller saying motivation doesn't have a part in CLT. Of course you're allowed to say that. You're designing your little research world. But then you have to be aware that like that's not the whole universe.
Right.
And I think advocates do sometimes take this too far. It is true that if you look at the research, you will find lots and lots of stuff about individual small nugget-sized skills. And if you apply that to English or social studies, that becomes especially ridiculous at the high school level, especially because the skills are big and they're holistic and they're not easily chopped down into things that you could assess in a 5-minute multiple choice exam or whatever. So that's the debate that I think needs to be had. Not like memory versus thinking, but instead like, is this map right here the whole territory? Or is it a useful thing that we can leverage, but there's going to have to be other parts of education?
Yeah. The idea of people shrinking the universe to what's in their purview versus thinking about the other things. And I think you're hitting on one of the things that is really a challenge. Is like, how do we get teachers to consider and use research because they don't have the time, but giving them an opportunity to consider some of the big questions, some of the big findings, not as a mandate or a prescription, but to think about in what ways does this help or would be a challenge, or is there in tension with what you think is true or what you do and all those kinds of things. I do want to wrap this up, but I want to come back to your blog piece because the complex learning and Slavokal Yuga, and I am going to not even try to pronounce his name, Marienboer.
Marienboer, I think. I don't know.
Yeah. I said I wasn't going to try to pronounce his name, and then I just did. So hopefully I got close to it. So I think the thinking of this complex learning is important. I tried to bring it up in my conversation with Sweller. Didn't really get a whole lot of traction, but can you kind of maybe help us think about that complex learning and germane load, which then became a thing, and then not a thing, and how that in your writing and your understanding of the tensions there, how those play out.
Yeah, well, Sweller's research has been mostly about math and maybe physics learning, problem solving, where that kind of small nugget-sized skill is really, you know, there's a lot of my teaching that involves teaching kids nugget-sized skills. So it makes some sense. There's lots of skills that just aren't built like that. I mean, teacher prep is one of them, right? You can't really, Doug Limov and the kind of no excuses world did try to do this to break down teaching into nugget-sized skills. I don't know I never experienced it directly. That doesn't seem to me. Maybe it's helpful. I mean, I maybe it's helpful for some people, but it's not the whole. I don't know how successful it is as compared to traditional teacher prep. I have no reason to think it's more successful. But right. So teaching is one example of something like that. Medical education is something like that. Writing education is something like that. There are techniques in writing, but ultimately you need a holistic understanding. And one way of kind of like getting at it is there are certain areas where the interdependency of the individual nuggets, if you isolate a nugget, it doesn't scaffold anything. It doesn't, it's really, or it would take forever to get from that nugget to ascend to the actual skill. If you took writing, or like first we're going to focus on like sentences, and then by the end of the semester, we're going to get to, paragraphs or whatever. Like, when would you end up at writing? Possibly never. So circumstance, and it doesn't need to be like the necessary nature of the skill. I mean, we have social reality. Like, this is how long you have to train doctors. This is how long you have to train writers.
Right.
So for whatever of all those things lead to this kind of complexity of learning, where you're trying to teach a skill that is not easily, for either circumstance or the nature of the skill, not easily divvied up into individual little skills that you can just teach every day and start reviewing and working back on. Maybe some of that can be helpful, but the skill itself that you actually care about is much, much, much more complex. It's got more parts. The parts are interdependent, and you got less time to, like, maybe if you had infinite time, you could get there, but like you don't. So the question is, can you just teach it by individual skills? And it doesn't seem plausible. And so these researchers who were attracted to cognitive load theory as a framework thought that you needed to bring in more. So Ben Marienboer began as a computer programming instructor. And the problem that he saw, I described this in the essay, was, and anyone who's written a computer program has experienced this, like, you just write stuff. You might know the individual pieces really well, but putting them together is its own mess. And to put them together is a big project, and there's no scaffolding there. So you'd have to know a lot of stuff right away. So what he did is he started knocking stuff out and asking kids to tinker with the code or complete a missing part of the code so that you're preserving the actual context even as you're messing around with things inside. And that's really, I think, a very powerful teaching technique for complicated stuff. It doesn't have to be that complicated to be useful. But that's a technique that you wouldn't think about if you were only thinking about teaching mathematics procedures. And there's other things like that too, which is that Ben Marienboer said part of the issue here is also motivation. It's pretty intimidating to look at a totally blank thing when you're starting out and write every line of code. So I've eased the motivational issue somewhat by having this kind of completion problem style thing with feedback. So he was also in actual classrooms and was thinking about motivation too. So there were these attempts, and there are things I don't know. Like, I don't know if they had arguments. I don't know. They wrote another paper when Van Marienborough was older, so they must have been in good terms, I assume. But like, I don't know how tense it was. I don't know if it was difficult. I don't know if they just didn't feel right. I don't want to get gossipy, it's like, and I don't want to, I'm just reading. I'm not a journalist. I didn't interview anybody. But you don't need to see that it's not going to be a natural fit for the parties involved. And germane load is another kind of thing that Van Marienborough brought in to the discussion, because it became clear that, like, you're not just trying to make things easier for kids. There are things that you could do to up the challenge. And every teacher knows this. There are challenging things that are good challenges. And managing those good challenges is tricky. And one way to do it is if you make the stuff that's unnecessarily hard easier, the stuff that doesn't matter for learning easier, you got more juice to help people, to allow kids or students to do challenging things. So within his framework, it's not just about minimizing bad load. It's about getting room for challenges, which is another kind of outside perspective to Sweller's that was brought into this. And again, like that's very close to how I think about my teaching. I think about worked examples when I use them as kind of like a kind of level up, a very quick level up that allows kids to do more sophisticated problem solving sooner. I can challenge them more because I've done a worked example. I've kind of managed I've given them this kind of skill with less cognitive load, so I can then ask them to analyze it and develop their conceptual understanding, which does take more cognitive load. So I'm very much kind of in tune with that personally. But then again, Sweller and Van Marienborough had different priorities. And so, Sweller might have said explicitly, or just this is the direction he went in. Yeah, if you want to teach medical students or computer programming, if you want to talk about students in a classroom, you might have to talk about motivation sometimes. Yeah, you might have to talk about skills that can't be broken down into individual things. But that's not what I think makes for the most exciting research. That's what I don't think is generative of interesting ideas. I think this simplicity generates interesting teaching techniques. So I'm in. That's what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I mean, hearing Sweller talk, I don't think that's his only perspective. I think he's someone who's kind of probably defined the world closer to his understanding. I disagree with that. I think he's probably someone who says, yeah, I think that school probably should just involve a lot of the stuff that I do. And I don't think he takes motivation. I think part of the reason why he rejects motivation from his theory is not just that he prefers to study this. I think also probably he thinks it's less salient than other people do. But even if he didn't, and even if he didn't believe that, and if I'm wrong about what he believes, I would still understand restricting. I think it would still be a valid choice to restrict cognitive load theory in the ways that he's written and talked about, which is that to preserve this research program, it's not productive to include these things. So,
yeah, I would characterize, and I really enjoyed my conversation with Sweller, and I think people make icons and heroes out of some of these folks, and Sweller being one of them. And sometimes in the process mischaracterized, but I appreciated what I thought was some humility from him, and but that sort of approach that he takes, I think, would be more characterized. I would characterize it more as focusing on the memory part and less on the thinking part, because the thinking gets to the complexity and perhaps a bit more cognitive load, which I think is really valuable, but also there's some risks involved and you need to do that really, really well. So I'm mindful of time, so we could philosophize and pontificate for hours, and people would start tuning out. So I want to give you an opportunity to share links and anything like that. But if there's any sort of parting thoughts or things that we haven't talked about that you want to talk about, the blog piece is on Substack. We'll certainly put it into the show notes. How much complexity can one theory take? But anything else that you want to say or need to say and share?
Oh man, you talked about a lot of good stuff. There's a lot of things I could say. I should probably plug my book, which
There you go.
yeah, which was published, I think 2021. So that's a while ago now. I haven't written the second book. I hope I do. But this is Teaching Math with Examples, and it's about worked examples. And I resisted the urge to talk about it earlier, but a lot of the stuff we were talking about kind of a fleshed out worked example picture, and what my lessons look like, and a little bit of my journey, that's in that book. By John Keft, published by now Hachette. I don't know.
Hachette, yeah. I'm not sure.
They were purchased, so I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know anybody there anymore.
Okay. Yeah, I meant to bring it up as well. Have it in my little notes here, but glad we got that out. You're on social media, obviously. You and I connected on the X platform. Want to give that handle and any other places?
Yeah, I guess. Social media, man. It's but anyway, if I'm on social media, which is often lately, sometimes less often, I hope. It's M Pershan. Michael Pershan is my name. So M Pershan.
Okay.
You can find me there.
All right. Well, Michael, thanks for doing this.
Yeah.
It's been a fun conversation. Hopefully, as I always say, hopefully folks have found it helpful.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.